The settlement looked still under the fading light, the kind of stillness that carried both safety and danger. Dust rolled along the main street, slipping into cracks of the storefronts and across the posts where two worn horses stood restless. It wasn't much of a town, just a saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a few houses scattered out on the edge. Beyond it stretched miles of dry land that burned under the sun, broken only by sharp ridges of rock. This wasn't a place that opened its arms to outsiders, especially not to someone like her. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Naomi came walking in from the flats, each step slow, heavy but steady. She was 23, though life had etched her face with lines of hardship that made her seem older. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and hip, stained dark with dried blood where a wound had half healed. Hunger had stripped her frame to bone and shadow, yet she held her back straight. She knew well enough what men in towns like this thought of women like her. Trouble, reminders of raids, of things they'd rather forget. For years, she had stayed away from them, but now she stood on the thin line between survival and collapse. To go back meant death alone. To step forward meant risk. She told herself this wasn't surrender. It was her choice to keep living. Her heart hit harder with every step closer to the yard at the edge of town. A corral patched with crooked boards stood there. She remembered this place. Once, when she was a girl, before soldiers and settlers scattered her people, she had played here. She remembered a boy who had shared bread with her, who had sat by the creek without fear or shame. That memory had stayed, tucked inside like a stone in her pocket, small but heavy. She didn't know if he would even remember her now, or if bitterness had erased it. Still, her feet carried her forward until she reached the gate. Ethan Carver was working by the corral when he saw her. He held a hammer in one hand, a bent nail between his teeth, his shirt clinging with sweat. 30 years old, weathered by too many miles and too many mistakes, Ethan carried the look of a man who had buried more than he spoke of. A brother dead in Kansas, jobs lost after drunken fights, years spent drifting where no one knew his name. 2 years ago, he had come here to build a quiet life, raising a few cattle, fixing fences, staying out of the noise of town. Folks said he preferred his own company, and they were right. It was easier than losing again. When he first noticed the figure at the gate, his body tightened with caution. He saw the torn dress, the way she braced against pain, and the unmistakable look that would draw stares in this settlement. His first thought was risk. A stranger meant questions, and questions meant trouble. For a heartbeat, he almost turned his back. Then she lifted her face, and recognition struck him. Naomi, the girl who used to sit by his family's fire, who brought berries from the creek, the one he had thought about in the quiet sometimes. She wasn't memory anymore. She was here, scarred, worn but standing. Naomi saw the hesitation in his eyes, and fear burned in her stomach. If he turned her away now, there was nowhere else. She steadied her voice, pushing down the tremor, and said softly but firm, "Don't you know me, Cowboy? I'm the girl you once cared about." She added, her tone edged with defiance though her knees shook. Ethan's jaw tightened. The words cut through years of silence and drifting. Guilt stung him. How easy it had been to almost turn his back on someone who had once mattered. He weighed the danger, the town, the whispers her presence would stir. But then he dropped the board he was holding, pulled the nail from his teeth, and crossed to the gate. He didn't greet her with promises. He just pushed the gate open, stepped aside, and nodded toward the stoop where a bucket of water sat in the shade. His voice was steady. "Sit." Naomi stepped inside, her legs weak with relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt a shift inside her. Fear wasn't gone, but she wasn't alone anymore. She lowered herself onto the stoop, careful not to tear her side. She reached for the ladle with trembling hands. The first swallow burned her throat, but she drank until her chest eased. Ethan stood a few paces back, hammer still in hand, silent, his eyes watching her. He knew what her presence meant. Trouble with the town. Yet he also knew he couldn't send her back into the flats. Not like this. Not when her dress was dark with blood, and her strength barely held her upright. Inside the small house, the air was close and heavy. The room was plain: one table, two chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, shelves with jars of beans and corn. Ethan had built it for one, never for company. He motioned her in. She stepped across the threshold with hesitation, knowing how rare it was for someone to open a door for her. He pointed at the table, then set down his plate left from his own meal: cornbread, bacon, beans thick with grease. She looked at him, waiting, not wanting to assume. He gave a short nod. Eat. That one word was enough. Naomi ate in small bites, her eyes low, as if afraid he might take the food back. The beans were thick, the bread dry, but it was more than she had tasted in weeks. Every swallow steadied her body, even as her ribs ached. Ethan poured water into a basin and set a folded cloth beside it. He hesitated, knowing silence weighed heavier than words. At last, his voice came, low and measured. You walked far. From where? She chewed slowly, then answered, from the river west. Soldiers scatter my people. I kept moving east. Weeks. Her tone was flat, not dramatic, but it carried truth in every word. She paused, her eyes flicking up to meet his. I avoided ranchers' dogs, hid when I had to. Thought I wouldn't see another settlement. Ethan said nothing at first, but the memory of that year came back sharp. The soldiers driving families out, the anger in his father's voice, the camps burned. He remembered the girl who had disappeared with the rest. Looking at her now, thin and scarred, guilt twisted in his chest. He had gone on with life while hers had been torn apart. Naomi pushed her plate away after finishing half. Careful not to look greedy, she untied a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a roll of sinew thread, a bone needle, and a scrap of cloth, her only supplies. With steady eyes, she said, I need to stitch the wound again. She touched her side where blood had stiffened the fabric. Ethan didn't move right away. Part of him wanted to leave the room, to avoid seeing what she carried. But another part, stronger, refused to turn away. Without a word, he lifted the lamp closer, the yellow light falling across her face. She gritted her teeth as the needle pierced her skin, her breath catching sharp. Her hand shook, the first stitch slipping. Take it slow, Ethan said quietly, his voice holding no pity, just steadiness. She steadied herself and continued, knotting each stitch with care until her face turned pale with effort. When it was done, she tore a strip from her hem and wrapped it around her ribs. Ethan poured hot water into a cup, dropped willow bark inside, and set it in front of her. She touched the cup, her eyes rising just enough to give him the faintest nod. Gratitude without words. The silence between them grew thick, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people carrying memories they hadn't decided if they could share again. Naomi wondered if he would let her stay, or if this was only for the night. She also thought of the town, of eyes that would turn the moment they saw her. Ethan wondered the same. He could already hear the whispers at the store, the sheriff's questions. Yet he didn't speak it aloud. He sat across from her finally, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as though it might hold an answer. The truth was simple. She could not last alone much longer, and he had already spent too many years pushing people away. He didn't want to do it this time. That night, she lay on his bed while he sat in the chair, listening to the creak of the house. The faint murmur of town carried on the wind. When pain woke her near midnight, he rose without a word, warmed a rag by the stove, and laid it across her ribs. She accepted it with only a glance, something unspoken in it, fragile but real. Morning broke pale, the kind of chill that lingered before the sun rose over the flats. Ethan stepped outside early, his coffee cooling on the rail as he checked the fence line. He hadn't slept much. Each time his eyes closed, he saw her stitching herself by lamplight, her jaw clenched, her hands shaking. It stirred something he didn't want to name, respect, but also unease. Inside, Naomi had woken before dawn. She swept the floor with a crude broom, moving carefully so her ribs didn't pull. She boiled the leftover beans, added herbs from her pouch, and set the pot on the stove, filling the room with a sharp, earthy scent. She worked quietly, not out of comfort, but because survival had taught her this truth. People judged not only your words, but how useful you were. By mid-morning, the first sign came. The storekeeper's boy wandered down the road with a sack of feed. Barely 12, he slowed at the fence, eyes wide when he saw Naomi sitting in the sun. He lingered long enough to memorize her face before running back toward town. Naomi's stomach tightened. She had lived near settlements long enough to know how whispers spread. Ethan came back into the yard, catching her eyes as she shifted uneasily. He didn't need her to explain. It started, he said flatly. She only nodded. By noon, two men leaned outside the saloon, smoking, pointing toward Ethan's place. They didn't move closer, but their presence was enough. An hour later, the sheriff rode past, his horse steady, dust rising under its hooves. Sheriff Burke wasn't a hot-tempered man. He had scars of his own from the war and kept order with patience more than force. Still, his badge meant weight, and when he stopped by the gate, it was clear this wasn't just chance. "Morning, Ethan," the sheriff said, his eyes resting on the woman at the stoop. Naomi rose straight, though her side still burned. She met his gaze without lowering her head. Ethan walked to the fence, resting one hand on the top board. "Boy says you've got company," Burke said evenly. "That true?" "That's right." The sheriff studied Naomi longer, his expression unreadable, then turned back to Ethan. "You know how folks here will take it. Doesn't matter if she's hurt or not. Talk spreads and talk brings heat." Ethan kept his voice steady. "She's broken no law. Didn't say she had." Burke shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "But I've got to keep order. If men decide to handle it themselves, order's harder to hold." Naomi listened without flinching. She had lived under suspicion too many times to be surprised. Still, she spoke, her voice clear though soft. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I asked for food, not trouble. If that is too much, I'll leave." Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned to her, the thought of letting her walk back into the flats cutting deeper than he expected. He shook his head firmly. "You're not leaving." The sheriff's eyes flicked between them, weighing the choice. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I'll keep folks under my eye. That buys you time. But don't fool yourself. Eyes will stay on you." He tipped his hat, pulled the reins, and rode off. When the dust settled, Ethan exhaled, his chest tight. He looked at Naomi. Her shoulders sagged, slightly for the first time since she had arrived. She whispered, almost to herself, "It begins the same everywhere." Ethan heard it and knew the truth pressing heavier than ever. He had made his choice already, even if he hadn't said it out loud. That night, he let her sleep on the bed again while he took the chair. And when the stove cracked in the dark and the silence pressed in around them, both knew that for now, neither was reaching for the door. The sheriff's warning lingered in Ethan's mind the next morning. He rose before the sun, out of habit more than rest, and found Naomi already awake. She had folded the blanket neatly, swept the floor again, and sat by the stove with a small pot simmering. The smell of beans mixed with sage filled the room. Ethan noticed the way she moved, slow, cautious, pressing her side when she thought he wasn't watching. She never complained, but the pain showed in every careful gesture. Over coffee, Ethan weighed his choices. He knew the town's whispers would grow louder. If she was seen as idle or a burden, it would turn sharper. Folks here measured worth by work, not words. If Naomi was to stay, she couldn't be seen as hiding. She had to prove she belonged. He cleared his throat. His voice was steady but low. "Fence on the north side's loose. Need a hand with the wire." He left it open. An offer, not an order. Naomi looked at him, reading the meaning beneath the words. He wasn't testing her strength. He was giving her a way to stand beside him, not behind him. She set the pot aside, tightened the cloth around her ribs, and gave a small nod. "Show me." They walked out into the yard together. The boards leaned where cattle had pressed through last season, the ground undercut by dry wind. Ethan carried a shovel and a spool of wire. She carried a hammer. He dug while she steadied the post, her face tightening with pain, but her hands refusing to let go. When the wire slipped, she adjusted her grip without waiting for him to correct her. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye. Her movements were sure, practiced, not a ranch hand maybe, but of someone who had worked with her hands long enough to know the rhythm of labor. By midday, they had reset 2 posts and braced a corner. Sweat clung to their skin, dust rising with every strike of the hammer. Neither spoke much beyond what was needed. Hold it steady. Hand me the nail. Pull tighter. Their silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that builds trust, forged in work, not words. When they paused to drink, Ethan finally asked the question that had weighed on him since the night she arrived. What kept you alive all this time? Naomi didn't look away. Her voice was even, stripped of drama. Prickly pears, creek water, roots when I could find them. Stayed low, avoided trails. If soldiers had seen me, I wouldn't be here. Her plain words sat heavy between them. Ethan pictured her moving through the flats alone, carrying wounds with no help. He realized then how deliberate her choice had been to come here. Not just desperation, but memory. She had remembered the boy who once shared bread, and she had believed he might not turn her away. That afternoon, Naomi insisted on cooking. She took what little they had, cornmeal, beans, a strip of pork, and stretched it into something that felt like a meal. She added herbs from her pouch, stirring slowly while the steam filled the small house. Ethan sat at the table, watching her. He thought about how long it had been since another person had moved through this room, since he had heard the sound of someone else's hands at the stove. He had built this place to keep others out, but with her here, it no longer felt empty. When the food was ready, she placed his bowl in front of him first. It was a small gesture, but Ethan noticed it. He gave a short nod. Respect. They ate without hurry. For the first time since her arrival, the silence between them carried less weight. Later that day, when Ethan prepared to ride into town for supplies, Naomi asked quietly, "Do you want me to stay inside?" The question revealed more than fear. It revealed the ache of someone used to being hidden away. Ethan considered. Hiding her wouldn't stop suspicion. It would only feed it. "Stay in the yard," he answered plainly. "Work if you can. People notice work more than shadows." She gave a faint smile, almost like the ghost of the girl he once knew. "Then I'll work." At the store, Ethan bought flour, salt, and a bolt of coarse cotton. The storekeeper's eyes narrowed, but Ethan met his stare without flinching. "She'll need the cloth," he said, paying in cash. It was the first time he had spoken of her, as if she belonged. When he returned, Naomi had swept the porch, gathered kindling, and washed the plates. She stood waiting, her hands raw from scrubbing, her chin lifted. Ethan handed her the cloth without comment, and she accepted it with quiet dignity. That night, as they sat by the stove, Ethan spoke of the land, something he hadn't done with anyone in years. Back quarters got good soil if worked right. Needs a windbreak. Could plant corn there next spring. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe to test the sound of a future spoken aloud. Naomi studied him, then answered, "Windbreak needs brush set low. I can show you. We did that south of the river." The moment hung between them. It wasn't a promise yet, but it was more than survival. For the first time, the thought of building something together pressed into both their minds, though neither said it outright. When the lamps were turned low, Ethan took the chair again and left her the bed. She lay awake a while, her ribs aching less than before, listening to his steady breathing. For the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes without fear of what waited when she opened them. And Ethan, staring into the dark, realized that the house he had built as a shield for his loneliness no longer felt like a place meant for one. The next morning carried a strange stillness. The sky was pale, but a brown haze hovered far off on the flats. Ethan had seen it before, the kind of haze that meant trouble was rolling in. He set his jaw and tightened bolts on the windmill, bracing the blades so they wouldn't shake loose when the wind came. Naomi watched him from a stoop, her braid pulled tight, the coarse cotton dress he had bought for her wrapped firm around her ribs. She knew the weight in his movements. This was preparation. When he came back in the yard, she asked directly, her voice steady, "What's coming?" He studied her face a moment, then answered without softening it. "Dust storm. Bad one. Strong enough to blind a man if he's caught outside. We'll need water set close and every latch tight." He hesitated, then added, "You sure you're up for work?" Her expression didn't shift. "If I can't work in a storm, I shouldn't be here." The quiet certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Together, they moved quickly. Ethan hauled buckets of water to the corral troughs while Naomi tied cloths around the tops to keep the grit out. She limped when she bent, but forced herself through it. When the windmill creaked under the first push of air, Ethan looked up at the sky, then back at her. Inside soon. But first, the westboards. Help me hold them. They hammered planks over the gaps where dust could drive in. Each strike jarred her ribs, but Naomi gritted her teeth and held firm. Sweat traced down her temple. Ethan noticed, ready to take the hammer from her, but she shook her head. She wasn't proving herself to him anymore. She was proving to herself that she could still endure. By midday, the storm arrived in full. The air turned brown, swallowing the view beyond the yard. Dust pressed under the doorframe, sifted through every seam in the wall. Inside, Ethan shoved cloth into cracks while Naomi dampened rags and laid them across the sills. Their world shrank to the four walls of that single room. The wind howled, a sound like nothing human, rattling the house as if it wanted in. They sat at the table, eating what was left in the pot from that morning. Each spoonful carried grit despite their efforts. Naomi coughed, pressing a rag over her mouth, her eyes watering. "How long?" she asked. "Could be hours. Could be days." His voice stayed calm, though his eyes kept flicking toward the door whenever it rattled hard. Naomi studied him, the set of his shoulders, the way he kept steady even as the storm pressed harder. She thought of the boy she had known by the creek, restless, quick to laugh, and saw how different this man was. Slower now, quieter, but in that quiet was a strength she hadn't expected. Ethan found himself watching her too. Thin, worn, her side stitched by her own hands, yet she sat upright, refusing to show fear. He thought about the risk she had taken walking here, about the way she had stitched her skin without complaint, about the way she now sat facing the storm like she had always belonged in this house. It stirred something inside him he hadn't let himself feel in years. Respect, sharp and deep, edging toward trust. Night fell, but the storm didn't ease. Dust seeped into their blankets, coated the floor, settled in their hair. Ethan rose often to check the stove and the door, while Naomi kept dampening cloths and pressing them against the cracks. They didn't speak much, but when their eyes met in the lamplight, both knew what the other was holding back. Fear, yes, but also the decision to endure together rather than apart. By dawn, the wind broke. The silence afterward was heavier than the storm itself. When Ethan pushed the door open, the land was hushed and colorless under a weak sun. The yard looked half-buried, fence posts leaning under drifts of grit. He blinked against the brightness and stepped outside. Naomi followed, pulling her shawl close. They surveyed the damage together. It was bad, but not ruin. The cattle still stood. The troughs still held water. The windmill still turned. Naomi exhaled, the first breath she had taken in hours that wasn't choked with grit. She looked at him and said, "It could have taken us." "It didn't," Ethan answered, and for the first time since she had arrived, a faint trace of relief touched his face. They spent the day digging out the fence line, clearing the yard, and setting things right. Their hands raw, their clothes stiff with dust, but they worked side by side. The storm had tested them both, and neither had broken. By sundown, the land was scarred but livable again. That night, when they sat at the table with bowls of beans gone thin, Ethan didn't think of her as someone passing through anymore. And Naomi, with her ribs aching but her spirit steady, didn't feel like a shadow trying to disappear. The storm had left them both stripped bare. What remained was something harder to shake. Trust, earned the way only shared survival could earn it. For 2 days after the storm, Ethan and Naomi worked to clear the drifts that had piled against the fences and pressed under the door. Their hands were raw, their clothes stiff with dust, but the work gave them rhythm. By the third morning, the land looked steady again, scarred but alive. Ethan thought maybe the worst had passed. He was wrong. Late that morning, 2 riders came down the north road. Their horses moved slow but sure, the kind that carried men used to long miles. Both wore coats coated in trail dust, hats pulled low, eyes sharp. They didn't look like drifters or farmers. They looked like men who hunted for pay. Ethan leaned against the fence, his rifle within reach, but not raised. The taller rider spoke first, his voice carrying across the yard. "We're looking for an Apache woman. Came through after a fight near the river." Heard she made it this far. Ethan kept his face flat. Plenty of travelers pass through. I don't keep count. The second rider's gaze slid past him toward the house. Naomi stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale but steady. She didn't step back or hide, but the tension in her jaw showed she knew exactly what they were. The tall rider pointed with his chin. That her? Before Ethan could answer, another voice cut in. Sheriff Burke rode up slow from the ridge, his horse blowing dust. He had seen the riders long before they reached the gate. He stopped beside them, one hand easy on his reins. Morning, gentlemen, Burke said evenly. You here on county business? The tall rider shifted in his saddle, annoyed. Private business. Bounty in Prescott. Girl fits this one's look. We'll take her and be gone. Burke's tone stayed calm but firm. Not without papers signed here. No warrant, no claim. If you've got something official, ride with me in my office. Otherwise, you're done. The second rider sneered. Since when does a sheriff protect savages? Burke's eyes narrowed, though his voice didn't rise. Since it's my job to keep law, not let men drag someone off on a rumor. Naomi spoke then. Her voice was clear, even as her hands clenched. My name is Naomi, daughter of Taza. My band was scattered weeks ago. I've broken no law here. She said it not as a plea, but as fact. The tall rider spat into the dirt. Law or not, there's reason enough. He turned his eyes to Ethan. You hiding her, cowboy? Better think again. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could step aside, let them take her, and it would all end. The whispers in town, the sheriff's watch, the stares. His life could go back to quiet. But he remembered the way she stitched her own wound by lamplight, the way she had stood firm in the storm, the way she had looked at him that first night and asked if he remembered. His answer was already set in his chest before he spoke. She's under my roof, Ethan said, his voice steady as iron. That makes her my concern. The riders shifted, their hands close to their belts. The sheriff eased his horse forward, his revolver low at his side, but ready. You heard the man. No papers, no warrant. You want to test it? You test me first. For a long moment, the only sound was the windmill creaking behind the house. Then the tall rider cursed, jerked his reins, and turned his horse. The second followed, their shapes fading against the horizon. Burke watched them go, then looked back at Ethan. You just made yourself part of this, Carver. They'll be back, or others will. You sure about this? Ethan met his eyes without flinching. I'm sure. The sheriff gave a short nod, adjusted his hat, and rode back toward town. When the dust settled, Ethan turned and saw Naomi still standing in the doorway. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried something deeper, fear mixed with gratitude too strong for words. For the first time, she stepped fully onto the stoop, closing the distance between them. You didn't have to, she said quietly. Yes, Ethan answered. I did. In that moment, the line between them was crossed. From that day, her presence in his house was no longer temporary. She belonged, and he had made it clear he would stand against anyone who said otherwise. For a few days after, the settlement stayed quiet. Ethan and Naomi worked side by side, repairing what the storm had broken, hauling water, tending to the small patch of ground where he hoped to plant. The sheriff didn't return, and neither did the bounty men. Yet both Ethan and Naomi knew silence didn't mean peace. It meant waiting. People were watching, measuring how long he would keep her under his roof. On the fourth morning, the waiting broke. A cry cut through the stillness of town. High and sharp, the sound of a mother's fear. Ethan was fixing a gate hinge when he heard it. He dropped his hammer and looked up. Naomi, standing nearby with a pail of water, had already stiffened. She knew that sound too well. Without waiting for him, she set the bucket down and walked fast toward the road leading into town. Ethan cursed under his breath and followed. At the well behind the church, a crowd had gathered. Dust kicked up under boots as voices shouted over one another. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, had fallen through the rotten cover into the shaft. His mother clawed at the stones, her cries tearing the air. The pastor shouted for planks, but none had come. The rope was too short. Naomi didn't hesitate. She pushed through the circle, ignoring the glares, and dropped to her stomach at the edge. Her voice cut sharp through the noise. "Bring me rope. Strong rope." The men hesitated, glancing at each other, unsettled by the sight of her taking charge. Ethan arrived, his voice like stone. "Do as she says." A length of rope was dragged forward. Ethan tied it around Naomi's waist, pulling the knot tight with rough hands. He leaned close, his voice low so only she could hear. "You sure?" She met his eyes. "I've hauled water from pits deeper than this. I can do it." Without waiting for approval, she slid into the dark. The rope squealed against stone as Naomi lowered herself into the well. Ethan braced at the top, his boots dug into the dirt, the strain burning his hands. The crowd leaned in, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Nobody moved to stop her now, not after Ethan's tone had cut through the air. The shaft was damp and narrow, scraping her shoulders as she slid down. She forced her body to stay steady, even though every pull against the rope pressed fire into her ribs. The air smelled of mud and stone. At last she saw him, the boy, clinging to a jagged ledge, his arms trembling, his face white with fear but alive. Naomi's voice softened, calm and low. "Hold on, little one. I've got you." She reached for him, pressing his small arms around her neck. "Don't let go of me, no matter what. Hold tight." Above, Ethan's voice rang sharp. "Pull." The rope jerked, rising inch by inch. Naomi clutched the boy, keeping his head against her shoulder. Her ribs screamed, her arms shook, but she didn't loosen her grip. The shaft seemed endless. The stones scraped her skin raw, her breath rasping with every lift. She shut out the pain and kept her focus on the boy's tiny heartbeat thudding against her chest. At the top, hands reached down. The pastor grabbed the child and hauled him onto solid ground. His mother collapsed over him, sobbing with relief. For a long, heavy moment, the crowd went silent, their eyes fixed on Naomi, still clinging to the rope. Ethan's arms strained as he hauled her up the last stretch, his jaw tight, his hands bleeding against the rope. Where her body cleared the stones, she dragged herself over the edge, coughing from the damp air, her hands raw. She sat back on the dirt, chest heaving, eyes closed. The silence broke, but not with the usual whispers of suspicion. This time it was different. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not anger, not contempt, something closer to respect, though no one said the word. The storekeeper's wife stepped forward, knelt, and placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. Her voice was soft but steady. "You saved him." Others shifted, their hard opinions dented by what they had seen. No one spat. No one turned their back. For the first time since she had come into town, the air around Naomi was not sharp with hate, but heavy with something uncertain. Sheriff Burke rode up moments later, his horse lathered from the push. He took in the scene quickly, the boy alive in his mother's arms, the Apache woman sitting pale and shaking, Ethan standing guard beside her. The sheriff tipped his hat, meeting Ethan's eyes. For the first time, there was no warning in his look, only acknowledgement. That evening, back at the house, Naomi sat on the stoop, her ribs wrapped tight, her body aching, but her spirit steady. Ethan handed her a cup of water and settled beside her. For a while, neither spoke. They listened to the creak of the windmill and the faint sounds of town life drifting on the wind. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. Her voice was low but firm. "Everywhere I go, I'm watched. Today, they watch me different." Ethan stared out at the horizon, nodding slowly. "You show them who you are. That'll be harder to forget than their talk." She turned her eyes on him, tired but steady. "You pull me out, too. Without you, I'd still be down there." He shook his head. "Without you, that boy would still be." The quiet between them wasn't heavy this time. It felt earned, the kind that came after something had been proven. Naomi leaned back against the wall, letting her breath ease. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt the ground beneath her belonged to her as much as it did to him. The next day, the air in town felt changed. Not warm, not welcoming, but different. At the store, when Ethan bought flour and nails, the storekeeper's wife quietly set a small sack of coffee on the counter. "For thanks," she said. The storekeeper didn't argue. He just cleared his throat and wrote the sale down without comment. When Naomi walked through town later that week to help carry supplies, No one spat at her feet. No one turned their back outright. There were stares, yes, but some were longer, thoughtful, less hateful. A woman at the well even gave a short nod in her direction. Naomi didn't mistake it for acceptance. But survival had just grown easier. Back at the homestead, Ethan began to speak more about the land. He had always thought of it as a place to retreat, not to build. But with Naomi there, the silence no longer felt empty. He pointed toward the back quarter, where the soil was darker near the ridge. If we set a windbreak here, hold enough moisture, we could plant corn. Maybe beans. Naomi crouched, dragging a line in the dirt with her finger. Brush should be stacked low. Keeps the sand from running under. South of the river, we use mesquite and yucca. Ethan knelt beside her, listening closer than he had listened to anyone in years. That night, when the lamps were turned low, Naomi lay in the bed, and Ethan took the chair as always. But she closed her eyes easier this time, and he, staring into the dark, realized his house no longer carried the weight of loneliness. It carried something else now, possibility. A few nights later, Sheriff Burke rode out to Ethan's place. He carried papers folded tight from the county seat. Sitting tall on his horse, he handed them down through the fence. Homestead claim. Back quarters still open. If you file both names, it gives her standing. Means no drifter or bounty man can say she doesn't belong if you're gone. Ethan unfolded the papers by lantern light, while Naomi stood beside him, silent but watchful. Burke didn't push. He just tipped his hat and rode back to town. Ethan folded the deed carefully, laid it on the table, and looked across at her. His voice was plain, steady. Saturday we'll ride in. File it together. Naomi's eyes searched his face as though trying to see if he truly meant it. You'd give my name to the county on your land? He didn't hesitate. It's our land. If you choose it. She didn't answer right away, but her hand touched the edge of the paper, her fingers trembling just a little. For someone who had lost everything, the thought of having a name written down in law felt almost too heavy to hold. The days leading to Saturday were filled with work, but the work felt different now. Less like patching, more like building. Naomi gathered herbs from the flats and showed Ethan how to dry them for medicine. She patched his shirt with the coarse cotton he had bought for her, every stitch neat and strong. He wore it and felt the weight of her care in each line of thread. Ethan began leaving the rifle on its hooks instead of carrying it everywhere. He realized the house no longer felt like a place waiting for trouble. It felt lived in, trusted. Naomi, in turn, began walking farther along the fence, her ribs healing, her steps stronger each day. With every lap, she claimed the ground more as her own. One evening they sat by the corral, watching cattle press against the fence in the cool dusk. Ethan broke the quiet first. When we were kids, you gave me dried meat once. First time I tasted anything smoked that way. My father didn't approve, but I didn't care. Naomi smiled faintly, the first true smile since she had arrived. I remember. You traded me bread. Soft bread. I never had bread like that before. For a while, they sat in silence, memories weaving between them. The bond was no longer just survival. It was history reshaping into something new. Saturday came, and they rode to the county seat together. Ethan signed first, his hand steady. Naomi followed, pressing her letters carefully, as if each one carried the weight of her whole life. The clerk stamped the papers. Sheriff Burke signed as witness. It was done. On the ride back, Naomi kept the folded deed in her pouch. More than once she touched it, not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself it was real. For the first time since the night she fled the river, she felt the ground might finally hold her. That evening, they ate cornbread and beans by lamplight. No promises were spoken, but both understood the papers meant more than words. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She belonged. But a claim on land didn't erase old eyes or old hate. Trouble returned at sundown a week later. 3 men rode in slow from the North Road. Ethan knew them, saloon leaners, men who stirred talk more than they worked. But tonight their laughter carried something sharper. One had a bottle half empty, another rested his hand too close to his revolver, and the third spat with every step of his horse like he was marking the yard. Naomi was carrying a basket of kindling when she saw them. She set it down, her shoulders stiff, and walked toward the porch where Ethan had just stepped out. He carried no rifle, only the revolver at his hip, but the way he stood was enough. The leader, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, called out loud enough for all to hear. "Evening, Carver. Looks like you made yourself a new arrangement. Paper or not, folks don't take kindly to an Apache woman playing homesteader." Ethan leaned against the post, arms loose, his voice flat. "You've had your say. Now ride on." The second man laughed, sharp and ugly. "We're not here for talk. You keep her. You're choosing sides you can't hold. Turn her out now. We're done." His hand brushed his revolver slow, letting the gesture hang heavy. Naomi moved closer to the porch, her hands steady on the gate latch. Her ribs still ached some days, but she stood firm. If they came through, she'd hold the gate until Ethan fired. Her mind raced, not with fear of dying, but with fear of being dragged back to a life of running when she had only just found ground that felt solid. The standoff might have broken bloody, if not for the voice that came from the elm beyond the fence. "That's far enough." Sheriff Burke stepped out of the shadows, his revolver low but ready. He had been watching since dusk, knowing men like these wouldn't keep quiet long. The scar man sneered. "Sheriff, this ain't your fight." Burke's jaw tightened. "It's the county's fight if you draw on a man at his own fence. Push it, and I'll bury the first one who does." The men hesitated. The leader spat again, but the sound carried less power this time. "This ain't over, Carver. You'll wish you thought harder." With that, he yanked his reins, and the three horses turned back toward town, their curses fading into the dusk. The yard went quiet. Ethan lowered his hand from his revolver, but kept his eyes on the road long after the riders vanished. Burke holstered his gun, looked square at Ethan. "You've made your choice clear. Don't expect it to get easier." Ethan gave a short nod. "Didn't ask for easy." The sheriff tipped his hat toward Naomi. "You held steady." Then he turned and rode off, leaving them in the cooling air. Inside, when the lamps were lit, Ethan sat cleaning his revolver in silence. Naomi laid her hand gently over his. Not for comfort, not for thanks, but as a mark of standing with him in the choice he had made in front of the whole county. He looked at her hand, rough, strong, then at her face. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They both understood. They weren't just surviving side by side anymore. They were bound together, in name, in land, in defiance of anyone who tried to tear them apart. The night after the standoff, the house stayed quiet. Neither Ethan nor Naomi slept deeply. They lay awake, listening for hoofbeats, for shouts, for the sound of men deciding to finish what they had started. But none came. When dawn broke, the yard was still. The corral was intact, the cattle lowing softly, the land spread wide and empty except for the call of morning birds. The threat had passed for now. In the days that followed, something shifted in town. The riders who had threatened them didn't return. Word spread that the sheriff himself had stood at Ethan's fence with his revolver drawn. Folks weighed that against the well rescue, against the deed filed in both their names, and little by little, talk turned quieter. Suspicion remained, but open challenge faded. Men who once spat now held their tongues. Conversations drifted back to weather, cattle prices, and wagons from the east. Ethan noticed the change when he walked into the store. The storekeeper no longer narrowed his eyes, just weighed flour in silence. His wife even asked Naomi if she wanted more of the sage she had brought the week before. It wasn't welcome, but it wasn't hate either. And in the West, sometimes that was enough. Life at the homestead settled into a rhythm. Naomi planted along the windbreak, just as she had shown him, stacking brush low to keep the sand from running under. Ethan worked the back quarter with the plow, the rough soil slowly turning. Together they hauled water, patched fences, and shared meals stretched from little but made whole by hands working side by side. On a Sunday afternoon, Pastor Green rode out. He carried his Bible and a single folded page. He had spoken with Burke and the clerk, and he asked a simple question. "Do you want your claim filed as marriage too?" Ethan looked at Naomi. She held his eyes without fear, without hesitation. She said one word. "Yes." The pastor stood them in the yard. The windmill creaked behind them, the corral stretched wide. Sheriff Burke and the storekeeper's wife served as witnesses, their faces solemn but respectful. The vows were plain and short. Ethan signed his name. Naomi pressed hers beside his, the letters careful but firm. There were no rings, no flowers, no grand speeches, just ink, a stamp, and two hands that didn't let go. After the pastor and witnesses rode back to town, Ethan and Naomi sat on the stoop in the fading light, listening to the land settle around them. For the first time, neither carried the weight of wondering if tomorrow would bring a knock at the door. As summer deepened, the land answered their work. Corn pushed high along the ridge. Beans twisted up the poles Naomi had set. The cattle filled out, the troughs stayed clean. The house itself changed. 2 pairs of boots by the door. Her shawl hung beside his hat. Meals cooked for 2 instead of 1. The emptiness that had once defined the place was gone. One evening, as they leaned against the corral, Ethan spoke softly. "When you came that first day, I almost didn't open the gate." Naomi looked at him, her eyes softer now, carrying both strength and peace. "And yet you did." He gave a short nod. "I won't close it again." She slipped her hand into his, not as thanks, not as reassurance, but simply as belonging. The silence between them carried no fear now, only the weight of a life they had chosen together. The town never became warm, but became fair. No more bounty men came. No more riders leaned at his fence. The well behind the church had a new cover, strong and secure. The sheriff kept quiet watch, and folks turned their eyes back to their own lives. Ethan and Naomi's bond didn't rest on pretty words or promises of forever. It showed itself in work. The water left waiting on the stoop, the rope tied right at the well, the deed signed in both names. What had begun as survival had grown into permanence. The land, once silent and lonely, had become their home. By the end of summer, with corn high along the windbreak and cattle lowing in the dusk, their story carried no question marks. They had faced the storm, the riders, the town, and each other. And through it all, they had chosen to remain. The West didn't often give gifts. It was hard land, shaped by loss and silence. But for those who stood their ground, who opened gates when fear said to close them, it could give something rarer than comfort. It could give a place to belong. And that was the lesson left behind. That love, in its truest form, wasn't born from ease or promises. It was born from the hard choice to stay when leaving would have been simpler. To face storms, dangers, and whispers side by side. To hold fast, not because the world welcomed you, but because you refused to turn away from each other. In the West, that was love.